Hello everybody. So we have been looking at Standard 2 for the last few presentations, and we have looked at curriculum and learning and spent some time on that. We looked at professional development and spent some time on that, and now we're going to move into student services. So once we have a well-established curriculum in place, and we know that our teaching is adequate, students are learning, and where we see gaps in there, we're able to provide the necessary professional development to help our students. Now we can start getting a little bit more specific with our students, and that's this last standard, student services. So here we're going to talk about a number of things. We're going to start with general stuff such as student records and how we maintain student records and that kind of stuff. But then we're going to move into roles of people in the school who help provide specific student services. We're going to look at counselors and the guidance program and how principals should use that, and as I'll mention in a little bit, we're going to pick that up later on when we talk about specific school personnel. Then we're going to talk about specifically services for students who are receiving special ed services, students who are receiving gifted and talented services, and we'll end with students who are receiving English as second language services. So again, you can see the natural progression from a well-established curriculum, an effective teaching based upon that curriculum. Students are learning, professional development is happening to build in gaps where we're finding gaps in data. Now we're going to look at specific student services. So let us begin with talking about student records, and here specifically we're talking about the CUME folders. So as a principal, you're going to maintain the students' CUME folders in their in your office, and you will have access to these. Now this is important stuff that the text that we used to use recommend. The authors recommended be in the CUME folders. You won't find all this stuff in a typical CUME folder. The personal data sheet on the student, that is typically in there. Those next three things typically are not necessarily in there. A parent's report, where a parent would indicate the strengths that he or she sees in their in his or her child. And where some areas are where they would like to see growth. A child's self-concept, you can see how this would be beneficial to include ultimately at some point in the CUME folder for teachers to review. A sociogram, this is where a student fits in with their peers and how they interact with peers. So we kind of get the personal data sheet on the students, then we kind of skip those next three, then you'll also have your behavior reports and standardized test data. The standardized test data are always in the CUME folders, and typically this is where teachers will go as well. This is the reason they want to access the CUME folders, to look and see how a child has performed on previous standardized testing. The behavior reports, whenever you have behavior incidents, suspensions and so forth, you want to include these in the child's CUME folders. Now, what ultimately happens to these CUME folders is up to the school district. I think the best, personally, I don't see any problem with this. The best strategy I saw was when the child graduated from high school and had everything cleared, no library fines, etc., no lunch fees. They were simply given their CUME folder, and they could do with it as they wish. That releases the school from those liabilities of having this personal data around. So those are typical things that you would see in a CUME folder. So this slide is just talking about some general things that you as a principal need to do, and this is where these other services that we're going to talk about are going to come into play. As No Child Left Behind and now ESSA stresses adequate yearly progress and accountability, evaluating student progress, all of these things have become critical role in the 21st century principal. An assessment can serve various purposes, okay? So we're talking about all kinds of assessments here. We're not just talking about teacher-made tests, but here we're talking about those summative state tests that you get, maybe a plan or an Aspire by ACT that you put in a folder, in their CUME folder. But those kinds of assessments also help you understand a little about the student, and you can help along with the counselor or whomever guide the student in making various important decisions as they progress through high school. IQ tests, possibly, those are other assessments that are used. Certainly assessments dealing with that will ultimately be used to determine gifted and talented. There are all types of assessments that are used by principals to determine the student making adequate yearly progress. So this little checklist is just to give you an idea of how to use these assessments and what they can do. They can obviously help student understand him or herself. One of the things that I did not anticipate when I became principal but quickly fell in love with was that personal connection that you do get to make with students. And it is true that you see a lot of students in your office for discipline reasons, but that's not the only reason you see students in there. And so it's always good to carve out time to get to know your students, and you can do that by talking about some of these assessments they may take that show where their interests lie and where they could have possible future careers. So the assessments help the students understand themselves, their limits, or their potentials. Provide information for education, vocational counseling. Again, I go back to the plan assessment that helps students understand where their interests lie and a possible career as they're thinking about getting post-high school and what it would take to get there. Your guidance counselors are going to do a lot of this for you, as we'll see in a minute, but this can also help you as the principal in getting to know your students and working with your students. These types of assessments also help your staff understand the student population. It doesn't mean that if you're in a poor school, a Title I school that's a majority minority school, that you lower your expectations. It just helps you understand your student population and where you are and where they are. And I've had this discussion recently, the importance of having standards and being able to work up to those standards and get students to certain levels of academic achievement. There's a study done by Harvard, and you can go to YouTube and type this in and do a search for it, called the Pygmalion Effect. And it talked about teachers having faith in their students' learning. And it's a great study, and I bring that in here because you can use assessments to understand your student population, but please don't let that limit your anticipation for your students' abilities to learn. Okay? Watch that video. It's a great study, and it really shows the difference in teaching when teachers believe their students are going to learn. Assessments help evaluate the academic progress of students, of course. They help administrative staff appraise programs. One of the things that you're going to learn when you get into internship is that we use data. We want to see data. Keep in mind that schools typically receive about a third of the state budget, spread out among K-12 and higher ed and VOTEC. but a third to over a third of the state budget, that's a significant amount. And so when we're investing this kind of money, taxpayer money, I don't have a problem with using standards to appraise programs. And so how do you do this? You're going to work through a tiny bit of it in your internship to see if the program you create meets the goals that you've established for it. And if it doesn't, then you phase it out. Or you tweak it to make it better to address the deficiencies you found. Or it meets the goals and you're doing well, how can you make it better? But it's important to not blow off the idea that assessments of all kinds, especially standardized assessments, can help you appraise programs. Facilitate curriculum revision. It's an unbelievably important concept that we're going to see actually in our next presentation, dealing with the idea of continuous improvement. But certainly you need to use data in your curriculum revision cycle. Make instructional management decisions, kind of go together there, and make decisions about screening students, and finally make program decisions. So all of these things you're going to use assessments, primarily your state assessments, but all those other assessments that I just mentioned as well. And you will do this through the help of all the various people that we're going to see in just a minute. So you can't talk about assessments without talking about grades. And one of the toughest things that I've seen in some schools is when students clearly excel through the class according to the grades show they're doing well, and they get to a state assessment and they cannot pass the state assessment. That goes back to a curriculum issue. Okay, ultimately that is a curriculum issue. But as a principal, how do you deal with that when it happens, and what are some root causes of it? Well, number one, like I said, it's a curriculum issue. Your curriculum is not as demanding as the state assessment. So there's a misalignment between what is being taught and what is being tested, the taught and tested curriculum. So that's one thing. Other things, though, that you as a principal need to be aware of, especially if you're in a building that's large enough to have multiple sections of the same class. Maybe you have 3 classes of English 1 taught by 3 different teachers or something. So here are some things to keep in mind, just to make yourself aware of when looking at how teachers are grading students. Number one, this teacher variability. Are teachers grading assignments in similar ways? Is a teacher, if all the teachers were given the same paper to grade, would they all grade it as a B or as a C or however they're going to grade it? Make sure that you're aware of these variabilities and that you understand how they work, and that you work to get your teachers calibrated to grading things the same way. Okay. Unreliable aptitude scores for all students, policy variability, variety and alternatives to traditional methods. All these things are issues that come up when talking with parents about teachers' grades and why some grades are different, because, and this is really primarily in schools that have multiple sections of the same subject. How do you deal with that? What are the root causes of it? And then, like I said, as a principal, how do you deal with that? You work with your teachers to get through that. So on the next slide, what I just want to show you real quickly here are ways that grades are given. Now, most often in all the schools I've been into, most of them are done by percentage method. I've seen some in the elementaries that do letters. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this simply because just about everybody, when you get into high school, is done with the percentage method. But there are some other ways you can see here. The descriptive method, and these are pretty much in the rank as to how they are used, where percentage is the highest, T-score method is the lowest. Okay, the descriptive method is the only other one I'll mention here and describe to you, and it's simply describing what the students are able to do based upon what the standard would say they are able to do. Okay, the others, the percentile, where the student ranks in the class, the rank method, the T-score, the 3 group. You're going to learn how to do these last things when you get into ed research, and you learn some basic statistical descriptive methods. You'll come into these last ones, but really methods of reporting grades, just about everybody that I know of. In fact, I don't know of anybody other than elementary schools who don't do percentage grades. So let's move on then to the services that we provide directly to students. So we talked about how you as a principal can help students in general, but you're not going to be able to do that alone. You're not going to be able to go through those assessments, that plan test, different inventories or whatever. You're not going to be able to do that with all students. So where are you going to get help here, and how can you provide help to your students? So the first one we're going to turn to is our guidance and counseling services. There are 5 goals here that a guidance and counseling service does. Provide students realization of their student potentialities. This is really helping them understand the real world. Okay, I think that this is where I would bring in social capital, and the phrase that we use in research on what it takes to get to where the student wants to go. I'll give you a prime example of this. I had a nephew who wanted to be a veterinarian, and then finally one day I said, do you realize how many years of college it takes to be a veterinarian? And he had no clue, and he suddenly changed from veterinarian to ag teacher, and then he realized when he went into college that 4 years was a little bit longer than he wanted to spend in college, and ultimately backed out altogether. But if I hadn't have even told him how long it would take to get to be a vet, he would have gone off and started probably trying to do some veterinary schooling, and most likely still quit early. But this is part of what a guidance and counseling service can do for students, is help them realize this. They can also help children with developing problems. These can be social problems or emotional problems. These are not just this is not psychology in that sense, but the best counselors I've had were able to take students and talk to students, and again talk to them about the realization of where they are, and help them understand the causes of problems that they have and find solutions to those problems in the school. Used adequately, they are a vital resource to your school. And that is why later on, when we have time to spend and talk about specific personnel, you're going to see an interview with school counselors and talk about their role as school counselors and what their job in the school is. Guidance and counseling service can also contribute to the development of the school's curriculum. This is something I rarely see that I always recommend to schools, and this is primarily because your guidance counselors are people who know the realities of students sometimes more than the administrators do. And so you want them on those curriculum revision teams when they're truly going through curriculum revision. And part of a strong curriculum is including some strategies in there to address the needs of students who may be behind or may be ahead. But this is where your guidance counselors can really help contribute and give some realistic ideas as to how the curriculum can help meet the needs, because they typically know a lot of the needs of students in the school. Provide teachers with technical assistance. Again, this is working with specific children. And then finally, contribute to the mutual adjustment of students in the school, especially if you're in a building that where when I had sixth graders come in, they were completely changing buildings, and so it was a completely new environment for them. And so this is where your guidance counselors again can help. So these kind of all bleed in together. Help children with problems, the realization of the potentialities, help mutual adjustment, and so forth to schools. One more slide here just to reiterate some of the strong points of guidance and counseling services is the role of your school counselor. When they're in this role, they're going to help students deal with personal and social issues, educational issues, and career planning. Those plan tests that are done, while it would be great if you were able to talk to some of your students about those tests. I was a middle school principal. It's really your guidance counselor who is going to help them in their career planning. Okay. So major services then provided would be information. Your school counselors are a great source of information for students in all kinds of areas, as we said, whether it's personal, social, career planning, that kind of stuff. Placement and follow-up. Your career counselors are going to help with placement of students in higher education institutions, in career tech institutions, and then follow up with those students after it's done and find out what's happening, what kinds of things could have been done differently, and so forth to improve the program. So all these things are going to evolve around your guidance and counseling program. And like I said, we're going to talk more about this in a couple of presentations down the road when we interview some school counselors. So we have one slide here on special education services. This is definitely a major part of your building. Chances are you have around 10 to 12% of your students who qualify to receive special education services. Okay. As the principal, you're going to sign off on just about all the paperwork that goes through, the major paperwork that goes through, whether it's an IEP meeting, a meeting to look at data to see if the student qualifies to receive special services and so forth. So just a couple of things here, key legislations and key components of IDEA. Key legislations, we really start to see legislation in the early 70s with Section 504, and we have students who are served by 504 plans. Typically these are the students who don't necessarily qualify for special education services with a learning disability or a specific handicap of some sort, but still need some support in their education process. And so we put them on what we call 504 plans. Shortly after that, you see the Education for All Handicapped Act of 1975, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then your biggest one that really guides what we do is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And this was revised in the late 90s, and I think it was revised within the last 10 years as well. Some key things that come out of IDEA. The related services, what kinds of related services are needed for the student to be successful. These could be OT, PT, speech path, any kind of services such as those that your special ed teacher may deem necessary. These become a part, and the student has a right to these services, and so you as a principal are going to have to work to find out how to make these services happen. Due process is slightly different sometimes when it involves students receiving special education services. Certainly discipline is slightly different, especially as we get into more severe infractions in the school that involve suspension and so forth. And You will go into a lot more detail. You'll spend a whole week dealing with special ed services when you take legal issues. We talk about the various laws that have been created, and we look at cases that have gone before the courts on students with special education. The key thing here is make sure you're familiar with these terms and their legal implications. Remember that a principal must ensure the quality of education for all students. My advice to you when dealing with special education students is rely heavily on your special education teachers. I was very lucky because I had 2 special education teachers who were rock stars, and they knew the law, and I could easily ask them any questions and knew that when they came to me and told me something that it was legitimate. So they are tough to come by. So rely on your special education teachers, and when you get a chance, make sure that you have effective ones in place. So the other side of that spectrum then, and not necessarily this, I shouldn't say that, but we typically think of students receiving special education services as one end of the spectrum, and that's really wrong to think that, because some students who receive special education services excel dramatically in school and are also in the gifted program. So the gifted program, we only have one slide here about the gifted program, but your activity for this week is going to concentrate on your GT program. The area of GT is growing rapidly, and principals must be aware of how to best serve this population of students. Gifted students will not necessarily thrive on their own. They need and deserve the services, attention, and resources to best develop their gifts and talents. There are multiple ways to serve gifted students. Typically, the biggest drawback or biggest problem that I've seen with gifted programs in schools is that they typically rely simply on intelligence. Most students are admitted into gifted programs in elementary schools, and admitted based on their percentile rank on something like the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, the ITBS test, and they are sometimes given 30 minutes a week to go do an activity or something. And this is really unfortunate, okay? What I recommend typically when I deal with gifted programs in schools is that they broaden their definition of what gifted is. Look more at something like what Gardner described in his multiple intelligences. And they use this as a basis to admit students into a gifted program. And then what's admitted into the gifted program, what are the services provided to these students? 30 minutes a week to go meet together is not an acceptable program in my mind. How are these students' talents that you have identified being grown by the school? Okay, so think of an answer to that question and then address the needs of these students. But your activity is going to look at your gifted program. The last little program here we want to look at deals with bilingual education. So we talked a little bit about students in special ed services, receiving those services. A little bit about the students in the gifted and talented program. Now I want to talk about students in your bilingual program. If you have a bilingual program, as with gifted, students requiring bilingual services are growing rapidly. My rural school that I was last at, where I was principal, prime example, we had students who were primarily Hispanic, which is not uncommon in Oklahoma, but we started seeing an increase in Laotian students who spoke Hmong. And while we had teachers who could speak Spanish and talk to parents in Spanish, we had none to communicate in Hmong. And so that was a different reality, and it really let me know that we were ill-equipped to deal with bilingual education. We really had no formal process in place, and I think that's probably true for most small schools. But just to touch base a little bit and give you some ideas, I want to talk to you about some models for bilingual education, and then some specific English as second language programs. Okay. So just to acquaint you with these terms, the first one is an early exit model. This is a program where you take your second language learner, your English language learners, your ELs. They're taught their first language some, they're given some support, but it's quickly phased out. This is done by the end of first or second grade, and they're stuck primarily learning English at that point. Late exit is just the opposite. First language is phased out slowly. They're typically going to be taught in their first language, and this may alter and go back and forth between English and their first language until their first language is phased out about 6th grade. Okay, so this one you can see is much more, they're in there much more. Immersion. An immersion model means that all instruction is done almost all in English. And we'll see another example of the program that fits that model in just a minute. Dual immersion, instruction is in both languages. This is becoming more popular, especially with some wider languages like Chinese. I think Tulsa Public has a Chinese dual immersion program where instruction is done in English and Chinese, and ultimately students come out in fluent in both languages. Submersion, if immersion is bad, submersion is worse. This is where just throw them in and everything is done in English. And unfortunately that was the model that my school used because we really had no other model. Dual language, native English speakers are immersed in a minority languages and 2 languages are learned. Somewhat like dual immersion. The goal of the dual language program, I believe, though, is to become fluent in both in 2 ways similar to dual with more emphasis on both languages. So the specific models, this is specifically what you would see going on in your school. And this is what I ask when I go into schools. What's the model that you use for your ESL program? Pull out the most common, least effective model. This is where you simply pull the students out and help them. So you take them out of their regular class and you help them 30 minutes a day or 30 minutes every other day or so. And you are, the teacher is most likely teaching them in English, just doing it at a one-to-one basis. Again, that's the most common model, it's the least effective. A class period, this is where services are provided during a class period. Students are typically grouped by their language. And I've seen this in schools, it's not uncommon. In class period program model where, especially if you have a single minority language, the students would be sitting together and you would have somebody who could speak both languages, English and whatever the other language. In the school I saw this in recently, it was Spanish, and so the teacher would simply translate to the students exactly what the classroom teacher was saying, and the students could ask questions and back and forth, okay? That would be a class period model. Probably the most effective model is a shelter English or a content-based programs. You'll probably hear this as a SIOP model, the Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. And this is where teachers use visual clues, they may use pictures, they may use hand gestures, whatever it can be to help students understand English as they're going through. It's very common in SIOP rooms to see a lot of writing on the board or on the wall, lots of pictures on the wall, so students can really see what is happening in the language, the English language, and the teacher is helping them bridge those gaps to their primary language. Structured English immersion. English is our second language, is not used until the student has mastered his or her primary language. The SIOP model is probably the most effective, most used that I've seen. The structured English immersion is probably the most effective way of teaching English, but it's probably the most expensive, and therefore you don't see it as much. And this would be basically teaching the student in their primary language, again, until late elementary when you start making those transitions. Of course, it's troublesome when students have to take their test in third grade, and it has to be in English, their reading test. So that puts up a lot of barriers on some of the impact that programs can have, but it doesn't mean that you have to do away with the programs. And then finally, the last one here, the HILT, or High Intensity Language Training Program. Students giving several hours of intense English during the day. Typically, you see students grouped together, and they might spend half a day studying science or language or something, and it's all done in English, and then with some help from their teacher, and then they go out in their mainstream in their other classes. So the HILT classes would be have help of that ESL teacher in there, helping the students understand the language. So it gets a little bit convoluted, different words meaning very similar things, but just as you become familiar with these phrases, you'll see them in your schools and so forth. So that is kind of a summary of student services. Again, the student services, these are things that are going to help your students, and at this point we're really disaggregating our students. That's probably what I should have said at first. We're talking about services that help our students when we disaggregate them into different groups, whether they be students who need special services, students who need gifted services, students who need bilingual education services, students who need services in counseling, career planning, social, emotional health. All that can be provided by your guidance counselors. So just a quick look at student services and how all of these, when they're all working together, fit into Standard 2 for an effective principal